In the dusty flatlands of West Texas, where the wind carried more sand than hope and the sun burned down on endless cotton fields, a boy was born into a life that promised nothing. His family did not own land, did not own cattle, and barely owned their own future. They were sharecroppers, living from one season to the next, always one failed harvest away from hunger. The boy's name was Robert, but no one ever expected that name to be remembered by history. He wore patched clothes, worked barefoot in the fields, and learned early that in this world, nobody came to save the poor. If you wanted to survive, you had to fight for it. Robert grew up listening to the low hum of the radio in the evenings when his exhausted father would turn the dial and catch news from faraway places. One night he heard about airplanes, about men who flew higher than the clouds and fought wars in the sky. To a boy who had never left his county, the idea sounded like magic. He could not afford books or toys, but he built wooden airplanes from scraps and watched the sky every time a crop duster flew overhead. That sound, the roar of an engine, felt like freedom calling his name. School was something Robert attended only when the farm allowed it. His teacher said he was smart, but smart didn't pay the rent. By the time he was 14, he was working full days in the fields, his hands rough, his back already aching like an old man's. Still, every night he lay in bed imagining himself in the sky, far from dirt and poverty, far from a life that seemed already written. Then Pearl Harbor happened. The news hit his small Texas town like a thunderclap. The radio spoke of Japanese planes, of burning ships, of American sailors dying in the water. For the first time, the war felt real. It wasn't some distant European problem anymore. America was under attack, and boys across the country began dreaming not of baseball or farming, but of uniforms and glory. Robert didn't dream of glory. He dreamed of escape. He dreamed of a chance to become something more than a poor farmhand. He lied about his age to enlist. He had to. Nobody wanted a skinny, underfed Texas boy who had never even seen the ocean. But the Army Air Forces were desperate. They needed pilots. They needed men who could learn fast and endure pain. Robert had been enduring pain his whole life. Flight school was a nightmare. Many cadets came from wealthy families. They had flown planes before, taken lessons, and treated flying like a sport. Robert had never even sat inside an airplane before training. The instructors saw him as a joke. His accent, his rough clothes, his awkward manners made him stand out. He failed tests. He struggled with navigation. More than once, officers suggested he wash out and go to ground crew. But quitting was not in him. He stayed up late studying. He practiced until his hands bled. When others went drinking, he stayed behind memorizing engine diagrams and flight charts. Every failure only hardened his resolve. He wasn't fighting just to be a pilot. He was fighting his entire past. And slowly, against all odds, he improved. When he finally earned his wings, nobody celebrated. He wasn't the best. He wasn't the favorite. He was just another name on a long list of new pilots being shipped to the Pacific. Most people expected he wouldn't survive long. The Pacific War was a different kind of hell. The air was thick with humidity, the heat relentless, and the enemy invisible until it suddenly appeared. Japanese fighter pilots were among the most skilled in the world. They were veterans, many with years of combat experience in China. They flew light, agile planes that could turn tighter and climb faster than most American fighters. They were deadly, disciplined, and ruthless. When Robert arrived, the veteran pilots laughed when they saw him. A farm boy from Texas, thin as a fence post, quiet and awkward. He looked more like someone who should be milking cows than flying combat missions. His first combat flight nearly killed him. Japanese fighters dropped out of the sun like ghosts. Tracers filled the sky. Planes exploded. One of his squad mates was hit and vanished in a ball of fire. Robert's hand shook so badly he could barely keep control of his aircraft. He fired wildly, not hitting anything, just trying to survive. When he landed, he vomited beside the runway. That night, he considered quitting. Not because he was afraid to die, but because he was afraid of dying without meaning. He had escaped poverty only to become a number in a casualty list. Something inside him snapped. From that moment on, Robert changed the way he flew. He stopped trying to be brave and started trying to be smart. He studied the Japanese pilots. He watched how they turned, how they attacked, how they retreated. He learned their weaknesses. He learned that their planes were fast but fragile, deadly in a dogfight but vulnerable in a dive. Most importantly, he learned patience. On his next mission, instead of charging into battle like the others, he stayed back. He waited. When a Japanese ace broke formation to chase another American plane, Robert dove from above and fired. The enemy plane shattered in midair. It was his first kill. After that, things changed. He began to rack up victories, not by being reckless, but by being careful. He picked his fights. He never wasted ammunition. He never chased an enemy into a trap. Slowly, the poor farm boy became a predator. Japanese pilots began to notice. They had nicknames for American aces, and soon Robert had one too. They didn't know his name, but they knew his tactics. They knew there was a quiet, deadly pilot who struck without warning and left wreckage behind. He humiliated them. The best Japanese fighter aces, men who had survived years of combat, found themselves outmaneuvered by a boy who had once picked cotton for a living. They underestimated him. That was their fatal mistake. One battle made him a legend. A group of elite Japanese pilots was escorting bombers toward an American base. They had flown dozens of missions and rarely lost anyone. Robert's squadron was outnumbered and outmatched. Most pilots expected heavy losses. Robert did something no one expected. He flew straight at the bombers, ignoring the fighters. It was suicide, but the Japanese aces hesitated. No pilot should do that. It broke every rule of air combat. That hesitation was enough. Robert destroyed 2 bombers in seconds. As the Japanese fighters turned to stop him, he dove through them, firing as he passed. 3 fighters went down before they even realized what was happening. The rest scattered. That day, a single farm boy broke one of Japan's most respected fighter units. From then on, his reputation spread. American pilots who had once mocked him now followed him. Commanders trusted him with the most dangerous missions, and Japanese pilots feared him. But fame did not make him proud. It made him lonely. Every victory meant someone else did not come home. Every kill was another face he would never forget. He wrote letters to his family, but never told them what he had become. They still thought of him as their shy, poor son. By the end of the war, Robert had shot down 40 enemy planes. 40. Men with better training, better planes, and better support had not come close. He was one of the deadliest pilots of the Pacific War. Yet when he returned to Texas, there were no parades. His town was too small. His family was still poor. The cotton fields were still waiting. He went back to work. But something had changed. He was no longer invisible. The poor kid from Texas had humiliated Japan's best fighter aces, not with arrogance or hatred, but with sheer will. He had proven that where you come from does not decide how far you can go. And somewhere above the old cotton fields, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the echo of an engine, reminding the world that even the poorest boy can rise high enough to touch the sky. Even after the war ended, Robert did not sleep like other men. Silence frightened him more than gunfire ever had. In the Pacific, silence meant an ambush was coming. Back in Texas, silence meant he was alone with his memories. He would wake in the middle of the night, sweating, hearing engines that were no longer there, seeing flashes of burning planes that only existed in his mind. The people in his town thought he was a hero, but heroes were not supposed to look this tired. His family tried to understand, but how could they? They knew the poor boy who had left to fight a war. They did not know the man who had stared into the eyes of death 40 times and lived. When neighbors asked him to tell stories, he kept them short. He never spoke about the Japanese pilots he had shot down. He never spoke about the moments when he had almost died. He talked about the weather, the crops, and ordinary things because ordinary was all he wanted now. But the war would not let him go. Letters began arriving from men he had flown with. Some were broken, some were bitter, some were grateful. They thanked him for saving their lives, for leading them through impossible battles. One letter came from the widow of a pilot who had died in a mission Robert had commanded. She did not blame him, but her words carried a weight that stayed with him forever. It reminded him that every decision he made in the sky had shaped the fate of families he would never meet. The government invited him to speak at events, to pose for photographs, to wear his medals. He hated it. Every medal felt like a ghost. He had survived when so many better men had not. In the sky, he had been unstoppable. On the ground, he felt helpless. Years passed, but the legend grew. Aviation magazines wrote about the mysterious Texas ace who had outflown Japan's finest pilots. Young men wrote him letters telling him they wanted to be like him. They imagined him as fearless and confident, a man who loved war. If only they knew. Robert never loved war. He had loved survival. He had loved proving that a poor farm boy was not worthless. He had loved the feeling of control in the air, where gravity and poverty no longer ruled him. But every victory had carved something out of him that could never be replaced. One day, a Japanese delegation visited the United States. Among them were former fighter pilots, some of the same men who had once hunted him in the skies over the Pacific. They were older now, slower, carrying their own memories and regrets. Someone suggested that Robert meet them. At first, he refused, but curiosity and something deeper made him change his mind. When they finally sat across from each other, there was no anger, just silence. One of the Japanese pilots, a former ace, spoke softly through a translator. He said they had studied Robert's tactics during the war. They had tried to predict him, to counter him. They had failed. To them, he had not been a man, but a force. Robert looked at the man and saw not an enemy, but someone who had lived through the same hell. He realized then that the war had made them both into something neither of them had chosen to be. After that meeting, something inside him finally loosened. He began to speak more about his past. Not the kills, not the numbers, but the fear, the loneliness, the pressure of knowing that one mistake meant death. People listened in a new way. They stopped seeing him as a machine and started seeing him as a human being. And maybe, for the first time, Robert began to forgive himself. As he grew older, his hands shook too much to work the fields. He spent his days sitting on the porch, watching the sky. Sometimes children from the town would visit him. They had heard the stories. They wanted to know how a poor kid from Texas became a legend. He always gave them the same answer. I didn't believe the world when it told me I was nothing. That was the real secret. Not skill, not luck, but refusal. In the Pacific, facing Japan's best fighter aces, he had been outnumbered, outgunned, and underestimated. But he had never been weak. The world had just never given him a chance to prove it until war forced it to. When Robert finally passed away, there was no grand monument. Just a small gravestone in a quiet Texas cemetery. But in the archives of history, in the records of air combat, his name stood beside the greatest pilots of the war. The poor kid who had once worked in dusty fields had risen into the sky and written his story in fire. And somewhere, far above the earth, where no borders exist and no wars are fought, maybe he was finally free to fly without fear. As time moved forward, Robert slowly became something he had never imagined. A living piece of history. Historians, journalists, and military researchers began seeking him out. They didn't just want the numbers, the 40 kills, the records, and the medals. They wanted to understand how a boy with nothing had outflown some of the most trained and disciplined pilots on Earth. They wanted to know what gave him that edge when death was everywhere. Robert always struggled to answer. How do you explain hunger to someone who has never been hungry? How do you explain desperation to someone who has always had a safety net? The truth was simple and painful. When he fought Japan's best aces, he wasn't thinking about tactics or glory. He was thinking about survival. He was thinking about the little house in Texas, about his parents bent over in the fields, about the promise he had made to himself that he would never be powerless again. That memory gave him strength when others froze. In the air, every second mattered. Japanese pilots were fast, aggressive, and fearless. They flew like men who believed dying for their country was an honor. Robert flew like a man who believed dying for nothing was a tragedy. That difference changed everything. While others rushed toward death, he waited. While others chased, he calculated. And when he struck with the full weight of a lifetime of struggle behind him. The Japanese aces could not understand him. They were raised in military tradition, trained from youth to be warriors. Robert had been raised by hardship. The sky was not a battlefield to him. It was a chance to escape everything that had tried to crush him on the ground. Even decades after the war, veterans who had flown against him spoke with a strange respect. They said there was something unsettling about the way he fought. He did not taunt. He did not show off. He simply appeared, fired, and disappeared again. To them, it felt like fighting fate itself. Robert never saw himself that way. He saw himself as a scared boy who refused to give up. As his story spread, it began to inspire people far beyond the military. Poor kids from small towns wrote to him, saying his life gave them hope. They didn't want to become fighter pilots. They wanted to become something. Anything more than what they had been told they could be. That was when Robert realized something profound. The war had taken many things from him, but it had also given him a voice. He began speaking at schools, not about killing, but about courage. He told students that fear never disappears. Even the greatest pilots were afraid. What mattered was what you did while you were afraid. He said the sky did not belong to the strongest or the richest. It belonged to those who refused to fall. His words carried weight because they were not rehearsed. They came from a life that had been tested again and again. Near the end of his life, Robert returned one last time to a Pacific airfield where he had once taken off for battle. The jungle had grown back. The runways were cracked. Birds flew where fighters once roared. He stood there in silence, a thin old man in the place where he had once been unstoppable. He closed his eyes and remembered. The heat, the engines, the fear, the moment when the sky had opened and allowed a poor boy to become more than his past. When he left that airfield, he left a part of himself behind. But he also took something with him, peace. Because in the end, Robert had done what so few people ever do. He had broken the limits the world placed on him. He had faced Japan's greatest fighter aces and not only survived, but triumphed. And long after the planes had fallen silent, long after the war had faded into history, the story of the poor kid from Texas continued to rise, just like he once did, into the endless blue sky.